Condemned as a witch and cast out from the only community she'd ever known, Eleanor Sullivan faces certain death in the merciless grip of Montana's deadliest winter. Her frail body haunts the abandoned homestead like a spirit already departed from this world, until the day a solitary trapper with haunted eyes offers unexpected salvation. As whispers of her devil's work reach vengeful ears, what terrible price will be paid when one man dares to shield the woman everyone else has condemned? And as the longest night of winter approaches with sick children hanging in the balance, will her forbidden knowledge become their only hope for survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Sullivan's stomach twisted with a hunger so fierce it made her dizzy. 4 days without food would do that to anyone, even to a woman who had once been the most respected midwife in Clearwater Valley. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the latch on the abandoned barn door as January winds threw snow against her face. Like shards of glass, inside wasn't much warmer, but at least the howling wind couldn't reach her here. A field mouse scurried across the rotting floorboards, disappearing into a crack in the wall. "At least you have a home," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Just 3 weeks ago, this very barn had stored enough provisions to last her through spring: sacks of cornmeal, dried venison, preserves from her summer garden, and herbs carefully gathered and dried for her healing work. Now the shelves stood bare, their contents stolen by the same neighbors who had once sought her skills when their wives struggled in childbirth or their children burned with fever. Eleanor limped to a small window, wiping frost from the glass with her sleeve. The small cabin stood dark and silent in the fading light, no welcoming smoke rising from its chimney. No point wasting the last pieces of firewood when the cold had already settled so deep in her bones that she couldn't remember warmth. The memory came unbidden, searing in its clarity. Reverend Caleb Harrison at her door, his usually gentle face twisted with disgust as he pointed at the crescent-shaped birthmark behind her ear. The devil's sign, he had named it, after 2 children from prominent families died of a wasting illness despite Eleanor's desperate efforts to save them with her herbal remedies and poultices. "But I've carried this mark since birth," she had protested. "You yourself have seen it many times before when you've come for my remedies." The Reverend's eyes had narrowed with cold certainty. "Satan marks his chosen early, Mrs. Sullivan. He is patient in his wickedness." Behind him stood the faces of people she'd known all her life, hardened with fear and hatred, their familiar features transformed into something monstrous. They took everything: food, firewood, her precious book of remedies passed down from her grandmother, even her wedding band. Thomas had tried to defend her. Her gentle, scholarly husband, who'd come west to teach in their small frontier school, had stood before their door with his father's old rifle, telling the crowd to leave his wife alone. They beat him until he couldn't stand, then dragged them both to the town square. The choice was simple: leave Clearwater Valley forever, or burn at the stake like the witch they believed her to be. They fled that night, with only the clothes on their backs and what little food they could carry. Thomas's face was so swollen from the beating he could barely see the path ahead. Still, he held her hand, promising they would start fresh somewhere beyond these mountains. But Thomas never saw that new beginning. The cold, hunger, and his injuries improved too much. 2 weeks into their exile, as they huddled in this abandoned homestead 15 miles from town, his breathing grew shallow and rattling. By morning, Eleanor was alone, her tears freezing on her cheeks as she covered her husband's face with his worn coat. Unable to dig a proper grave in the frozen ground, she had wrapped his body and placed it in the root cellar, the closest thing to a burial she could manage until spring. Now 37 days since they'd left Clearwater, each one scratched on the barn wall with a nail pulled from the floorboards. Eleanor wondered if death might be kinder than this endless hunger and cold. Her dress hung from her once sturdy frame like an empty sack, and her fingers, once nimble enough to deliver the tiniest babies, now curled uselessly against the biting cold. She sank to her knees in the mouldy hay, clutching her mother's silver pendant, the only thing of value she'd managed to hide when they came. If she traded it in the next settlement, she might get enough food for a week. But the nearest town was 20 miles away across treacherous mountain passes. In her weakened state, she'd never make it through the snowdrifts that now stood higher than a man. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded wolf. Inside, Eleanor's stomach answered with its own pained cry. She hadn't cried since burying Thomas, but now tears burned behind her eyes. What had she done to deserve such hatred, such abandonment? The door to the barn crashed open, letting in a blast of snow and wind that nearly extinguished the small candle stub she'd been saving. Eleanor scrambled backward, heart hammering against her ribs. Had they come to finish what they started? To drag the witch back to Clearwater for a proper burning? A massive shadow filled the doorway, not the mob she feared, but something just as terrifying. A stranger, huge and faceless in the dying light. "Who's there?" demanded a deep voice as rough as stone. "This land is claimed." Eleanor cowered against the back wall, wondering if starvation might have been better than whatever this giant might do to a woman alone. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. "I have nowhere else to go." The figure stepped fully into the barn, pushing the door closed against the storm. As her eyes adjusted, Eleanor saw he carried a rifle in one hand and had a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. His beard was thick and dark, his eyes shadowed beneath a heavy brow. Snowflakes melted in his hair as he studied her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're from Clearwater," he said finally. Not a question, but a statement of fact. The name of her former home made Eleanor flinch. "Not anymore." The man's gaze traveled over her thin frame, taking in her hollow cheeks and tattered dress. Something shifted in his face. Not pity exactly, but recognition. "When did you last eat?" he asked, setting down his rifle carefully against the wall. Eleanor couldn't remember. The days had blurred together in a haze of cold and hunger. "Does it matter?" The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The smell hit her before she saw what it contained. Cornbread, still slightly warm, and a piece of smoked venison. Her stomach clenched painfully, and she had to fight the urge to lunge for it like an animal. "I'm not looking for payment," the man said gruffly, as if reading her thoughts. "Eat!" Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the food. "Why would you help me?" The stranger's eyes met hers, grey as winter sky, but somehow warmer. "Because they hanged my sister as a witch in Ohio when I was 14 for healing with plants they didn't understand." 20 years of pride dissolved as Eleanor tore into the bread, tears streaming down her face. The stranger watched in silence, his massive frame blocking the worst of the draft from the door. When she finished, he spoke again. "My cabin's 5 miles north. It's not much, but there's a fire and more food." He hesitated, then added, "My name is Mason Blackridge." The name meant nothing to her, and yet everything. A person who saw her as human when her own people had named her monster. Someone who offered help when everyone else had turned away. "I'm Eleanor," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "Eleanor Sullivan." Mason nodded once, then held out a hand rough with calluses. "Can you walk, Eleanor Sullivan? Or will I need to carry you?" In that moment, facing this stranger with his offered bread and gruff kindness, Eleanor felt something stir within her chest. Something she thought had died with Thomas. Not hope, she dared not name it that, but perhaps its ghost. And as the blizzard raged outside, she wondered what twist of fate had sent this trapper to her on this of all nights, and what price they would both ultimately pay. for his mercy. The journey to Mason's cabin nearly killed her. What might have been an hour's walk for a healthy person became a grueling, half-frozen nightmare. Twice, Eleanor's legs simply gave out, and without complaint, Mason lifted her with arms, strong from years of wilderness survival, carrying her through the deepest drifts. By the time the small log cabin came into view, Eleanor was drifting in and out of consciousness, the wind and cold having leached the last of her strength. Through frost-crusted lashes, she saw the glow of firelight through a single window, a beacon of impossible warmth in the white wilderness. "Stay with me now." Mason's voice rumbled against her ear as he pushed open the door. "Didn't carry you all this way to lose you at the threshold." The first step into Mason Blackridge's cabin stole Eleanor's breath, not because it was grand, it wasn't, but because heat wrapped around her like an embrace after so many weeks of bone-deep cold. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls. The small space smelled of pine, smoke, and something bubbling in a pot that made her empty stomach twist with painful need. "Sit," Mason commanded, gesturing to a chair by the fire. When Eleanor hesitated, he added more softly, "Please." Her legs nearly buckled as she lowered herself onto the wooden seat. The warmth from the flames made her skin prickle painfully as feeling returned to her frozen limbs. She hadn't realized how close to death she'd truly been until this moment, when its grip began to loosen. Mason moved about the cabin with surprising grace for such a large man. He ladled steaming broth into a wooden bowl, then placed it on the table beside her with a chunk of cornbread. "Slowly," he warned when she reached for it. "Your stomach will rebel if you rush." Eleanor forced herself to take small sips, though every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. The broth was simple, venison and wild onions with a few winter herbs, but it might as well have been a feast fit for presidents. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, between careful spoonfuls. Mason had settled across from her, his large frame, making the chair look child-sized. The firelight caught in his beard, turning the dark strands to copper. For a long moment, he didn't answer. "Because no one helped us," he said finally, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "When they came. For my sister Hannah." Eleanor's hand stilled, the spoon halfway to her mouth. "You said they hanged her." Mason nodded, his grey eyes fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls, seeing something Eleanor couldn't. "She knew plants for healing, called her a witch when the judge's wife died of childbed fever. I was too young, too small to stop them." The parallels to her own story hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And your parents?" Eleanor asked, setting down her spoon. "Father was already gone. Mother couldn't bear Hannah's death, took sick that winter, though I always thought it was grief that really killed her." Mason's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "I was sent to an orphanage until I was big enough to work in lumber camps. Then I came west, where a man can be left alone." Eleanor's throat tightened. This stranger had lived her nightmare long before she had. "I'm sorry." Mason's eyes refocused on her face. "Don't be. Wasn't your doing." "It wasn't my doing in Clearwater either," she whispered, the words carrying all the pain of the past months. "I tried to save those children." "I believe you." 3 simple words, but they loosened something in Eleanor's chest that had been bound tight since the day they dragged Thomas from their home. Mason rose and added another log to the fire. Sparks flew upward, bright as stars against the darkness. "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow, if you're stronger, we can talk about what comes. Next. The concept seemed foreign to Eleanor. She'd been focused solely on surviving each hour, each day. The future had ceased to exist. "Unless you plan to join your husband," Mason said bluntly. The mention of Thomas sent a shock through her system. How did you know? The grave marker. Outside the homestead, Mason explained. I saw it when I was checking my trap lines this morning. That's how I knew someone was staying there. Eleanor stared into her half-empty bowl, watching the broth ripple with her trembling hands. She had fashioned a crude cross from broken fence boards, carving Thomas's name with a nail. It was all she could offer him. I don't want to die, she admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. Despite everything, some stubborn flame still burned within her, refusing to be extinguished. Mason nodded, as if her answer satisfied some unasked question. Then you'll need to get your strength back. As if to emphasize his point, he placed another piece of cornbread beside her bowl. In the silence that followed, Eleanor became aware of the storm outside, howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. The same wind that had cut through her threadbare. Clothes like knives now couldn't touch her. Do you live here alone? She asked, glancing around the small space. There were signs of a solitary life. One chair by the writing desk, one cup beside the wash basin, one pillow on the narrow bed built into the corner. Just me, Mason confirmed. And now you, for as long as you need. The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Eleanor knew she should feel afraid, or at least wary. She was alone in a cabin miles from anywhere with a man she'd just met. But fear required energy she no longer possessed. Besides, her instincts told her Mason Blackridge was no threat to her, not in the way that mattered. I can't pay you, she said frankly. They took everything. Mason's expression darkened. I'm not asking for payment. Everyone wants something, Eleanor countered, years of hard experience behind the words. Yes, Mason agreed, surprising her. I want to sleep at night, knowing I didn't leave someone to freeze to death when I could have helped, that's all. Eleanor studied his face, looking for deception and finding none. This man was nothing like the people of Clearwater, with their smiles that never reached their eyes. His gruffness held more honesty than all their false concern. I was a midwife, she said suddenly, needing him to know she hadn't always been this broken thing. And a healer. People came from 3 counties for my remedies before they decided you were responsible for their misfortunes, Mason finished for her. Eleanor nodded, throat tight. People fear what they don't understand, Mason said, rising to check. Whatever was bubbling in the pot over the fire. And they hate feeling helpless. Easier to blame a woman with knowledge than accept that some sicknesses can't be fought. His insight startled her. This trapper, with his massive hands and quiet ways, saw more clearly than the educated men of Clearwater who had condemned her. As Mason stirred the pot, Eleanor noticed a jagged scar running from his wrist up under. His rolled sleeve. Without thinking, she reached out when he passed, her fingers brushing the raised tissue. This was badly mended, she observed, healer's instincts momentarily overriding everything else. Mason froze at her touch, then slowly lowered his arm so she could see better. Trap chain snapped 3 winters ago. Nearest doctor was in Fort Kearney. Did it myself. Eleanor traced the jagged line with her fingertip. I could have made this heal cleaner, less pain afterward. Well, you weren't here then, Mason said. Simply, no. Eleanor agreed, withdrawing her hand. I wasn't. Their eyes met across the small space, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of 2 souls, marked by the world's cruelty, but not broken by it. The moment shattered as rapid pounding on the cabin door made the hinges rattle. Eleanor's heart leapt to her throat as Mason's expression darkened. He moved swiftly to the corner, where his rifle leaned against the wall. "Blackridge, open up!" called a voice Eleanor recognized with sickening clarity. "It's Sheriff Wilson from Clearwater. We know you've got her in there." "Get in the root cellar now," Mason hissed, thrusting his rifle into the crook of his arm. Eleanor froze, her legs refusing to move as terror locked her joints. The nightmare she'd been running from had found her. "Eleanor!" Mason's voice cut through her paralysis. He pointed to a trap door, partially hidden beneath a worn rug. "They won't find you there. Go!" She scrambled across the floor, lifting the heavy wooden door with strength she didn't know she still possessed. The earthen chamber below smelled of potatoes and damp soil. Mason helped lower her down, his face grim in the firelight. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, "no matter what you hear." The trapdoor closed above her, plunging Eleanor into darkness, broken only by thin slivers of light through the floorboards. She pressed herself against the cool dirt wall, straining to hear as Mason's heavy footsteps crossed to the cabin door. "What brings you out on a night like this, Sheriff?" Mason's voice sounded perfectly casual, though Eleanor could detect the tension underneath. "We're tracking a fugitive, Blackridge." Sheriff Wilson's voice was clipped and official. "Woman accused of witchcraft and the death of 2 children in Clearwater. Seen your smoke from the ridge. Thought you might have had visitors." "Just me and my dinner," Mason replied. "Haven't seen anyone in weeks. Storm's been too fierce." Eleanor held her breath, hardly daring to move. Jars of preserved vegetables lined the shelves around her, their contents barely visible in the faint light filtering from above. She counted 6 pairs of boots shuffling on the floorboards, 6 men who'd ridden through a blizzard just to find her. "Mind if we look around?" A new voice, Jeremiah Porter, one of the town councilmen whose son had died. "Actually, I do mind." Mason's tone hardened. "It's my cabin, my land. I don't recall inviting a search party." "We have every right to search when pursuing a dangerous criminal," Sheriff Wilson said, his voice moving farther into the cabin. "This woman is a menace. Another child has fallen ill since she disappeared." "Must be powerful witchcraft," Mason said dryly, "to cause sickness from miles away through a blizzard. Or maybe your town just built on a swamp." A scuffle of boots, then Porter's voice dropped to a threatening growl. "Step aside, trapper. This isn't your fight." "You're trespassing on my property," Mason answered. "That makes it my fight." The unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked needed no translation. Eleanor pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle a gasp. "You're making a mistake, Blackridge," Sheriff Wilson warned. "Harboring a witch makes you just as guilty." "And threatening a man in his own home makes you a fool," Mason replied evenly. "Now get off my property before I decide this conversation is over." A tense silence followed, broken only by the popping of logs in the fireplace and the wind howling outside. "We'll be back," Porter finally spat, "with more men." "Bring whoever you like," Mason replied. "Outcome won't change." Heavy footsteps retreated, followed by the cabin door opening and slamming shut. Still, Eleanor didn't move, fear keeping her rooted to the spot. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the trapdoor finally lifted, revealing Mason's bearded face. "They're gone," he said, extending a hand to help her up. "For now." Eleanor's legs trembled as she climbed back into the cabin's warmth. The food she'd eaten earlier churned in her stomach, threatened by fear to make a reappearance. "They'll come back," she whispered, sinking onto the chair by the fire. "They always do." Mason nodded, returning his rifle to its place in the corner. "Not tonight. Storm's picking up again." He gestured toward the window where snow swirled in the darkness like angry spirits. "We have until morning at least." Morning. The word once meant hope, a new day, fresh possibilities. Now it loomed like an executioner's axe. "I should leave," Eleanor said, though the thought of returning to the killing cold made her body rebel. "I've put you in danger already." Mason's expression hardened. "And where exactly?" "Anywhere, somewhere they won't find me." Even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. Mason stoked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "You wouldn't make it 5 miles in this weather. Better I die alone in the snow than bring death to your door," Eleanor insisted, rising on shaky legs. Mason moved with surprising speed for such a large man, blocking her path to the door. "My door. My choice is who enters and who doesn't." They stood facing each other, neither willing to back down. Eleanor noticed details about him she'd missed before. a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the threads of silver in his dark beard, though he couldn't be much older than her own 30 years, the way his right shoulder hunched slightly as if it had been broken once and hadn't healed properly. "Why fight for a stranger?" she asked softly. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Mason answered. "I know what it means when men with power decide a woman is dangerous." The simple truth in his words broke something loose inside Eleanor, a dam holding back not just tears but rage. Rage at the unfairness, at Thomas's needless death, at everything that had been stolen from her. "They killed my husband," she said, her voice shaking. "Not directly. They didn't hang him or shoot him, but they might as well have. They beat him, drove us from our home in winter, knowing what would happen." Mason didn't offer empty comfort or useless platitudes. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Tell me about him." The request caught Eleanor off guard. No one had asked about Thomas since his death, as if speaking his name might spread whatever evil they believed she carried. He was a teacher. She began hesitantly. From Boston originally, came west because he believed in bringing knowledge to frontier children. The memory of Thomas's gentle hands guiding a child's fingers across a slate threatened to choke her. But she pushed on. He loved books more than anything, said they were windows to worlds we might never see otherwise. As she spoke, Mason moved about the cabin, gathering extra blankets and adding another log to the fire. The simple tasks gave her space to find. Her words, to remember Thomas as he had been, not as he ended. "He believed in me," she finished quietly. "Even at the end, when everyone else turned away." Mason paused in his work, meeting her eyes across the room. "Then honor that belief by surviving." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's shutters. Inside, something subtle shifted between them. Not quite trust, but "it's beginning." "We'll leave at first light," Mason said, spreading a blanket on the floor beside the hearth. "I know places they won't think to look." "We?" Eleanor echoed. "You won't make it alone," he said simply. "And I've been thinking of moving on anyway." The casual way he offered to upend his life for her was almost too much to bear. "I can't ask that of you." "You didn't ask," I offered. Mason gestured to the narrow bed built into the wall. "Take that tonight. You need real rest. I'll keep watch." Too exhausted to argue further, Eleanor sank onto the bed. The pillow smelled of pine and leather, Mason's scent. The blanket was heavy and warm, instantly cocooning her in unexpected comfort. "What if they come back before morning?" she murmured, already half asleep despite her fear. "Then they'll learn why the mountain folk call me the ghost," Mason replied, checking his rifle one last time before settling into the chair by the door. Eleanor wanted to ask what he meant, but sleep pulled her under, deeper than she'd managed in weeks. Her last conscious thought was that tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing it alone. In the dark hours before dawn, Mason moved silently around the cabin, gathering only what they would need: food, ammunition, his best skinning knife, the medicine pouch his sister had taught him to prepare before the townspeople took her. He glanced occasionally at the sleeping woman, noting how the deep lines of pain and hunger had softened somewhat in rest. He had told her the truth earlier. He had been considering moving on. This cabin held too many solitary nights, too many memories of returning to emptiness, but he hadn't planned on leaving with a woman accused of witchcraft. A woman whose eyes held the same haunted look his sister's had all those years ago. As he packed, Mason wondered what twist of fate had led him to check that abandoned homestead yesterday. What invisible thread had connected his life to Eleanor Sullivan's at the exact moment she needed saving? His sister would have called it spirit guidance. The preacher would name it God's will. Mason had no name for it, but he recognized its weight. Outside, the storm began to ease, stars appearing between racing clouds. Soon it would be light enough to travel. Soon they would leave this place that had been his refuge and his prison for 4 winters. And as the darkness gradually surrendered to dawn, Mason realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and cornmeal frying. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in her own cabin with Thomas, before everything had shattered. Then reality rushed back as she saw Mason's broad back at the small cast-iron stove. "You should eat before we go," he said without turning. "We've got hard traveling ahead." Eleanor sat up, surprised at how much stronger she felt after just one night of warmth and food. The hunger was still there, but duller now, more manageable. "Where are we going?" she asked, accepting the tin plate he offered. The cornmeal cakes were simple but filling, drizzled with precious maple syrup. "North and west," Mason replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "I've got a line cabin near the Echo River. No one goes there in winter." "How far?" 3 days, if the weather holds." He glanced at the window where dawn was breaking clear and cold. "Sheriff will be back with more men once they can ride. We need to be long gone before then." Eleanor ate quickly, knowing each minute was precious. When she finished, Mason handed her a bundle of clothes. "These will be too big, but they're warm." "My sister's," he added quietly. The simple deerskin dress and wool leggings were indeed too large, but after weeks in her tattered clothes, they felt like the finest silk. Mason turned his back while she changed, offering a privacy that touched her deeply after so much degradation. "Thank you," she said when she finished. The word seemed inadequate for all he'd done, but it was all she had to offer. Mason nodded once, then handed her a pair of snowshoes. "Ever use these?" "No. You'll learn fast. It's that or sink to your waist with every step." The next hour was spent in preparation, packing food, securing the cabin, brushing away any signs of their presence. Mason worked with methodical efficiency, showing Eleanor how to strap the unfamiliar snowshoes to her feet, how to walk without tangling the wooden frames. "Ready?" he asked finally, slinging a pack over his shoulder and taking up his rifle. Eleanor looked around the cabin one last time, at the fire now damped down to embers, at the chair where she'd eaten her first real meal in weeks, at the bed where she'd finally slept without fear. "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. Outside, the world was transformed. The blizzard had left a pristine blanket of white stretching in all directions, unmarked by human or animal tracks. The morning sun turned each snow crystal into a miniature diamond, so brilliant it hurt the eyes. "We'll head north through the timber," Mason said, adjusting the straps on Eleanor's pack. "Stay in my tracks. If you fall, call out. Don't try to. Get up alone in deep snow." Eleanor nodded, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Already she could feel the bitter cold seeping through her borrowed clothes. But it was different now. A challenge to be met, not a death sentence to be endured. Bess set out single file, Mason breaking trail through snow that came to mid-thigh even with the snowshoes. Eleanor struggled to keep pace, her muscles protesting after weeks of starvation and inactivity. By midday, every part of her body screamed for rest. Her feet were blistered from the unfamiliar bindings, her shoulders ached from the small pack, and her lungs burned with each icy breath. Just as she was about to call out that she needed to stop, Mason paused in a small clearing, sheltered by massive pines. "We'll rest here," he said, brushing snow from a fallen log to create a seat. "Not for long. They'll be on our trail by now." Eleanor sank gratefully onto the log, accepting the strip of dried venison he offered. "How do you know?" "Tracks," Mason said simply, gesturing back the way they'd come. Hard to hide in fresh snow. Fear, which had receded during the exertion of travel, came rushing back. "Will they follow us all the way to your cabin?" Mason's face was grim as he chewed his own portion of venison. "They'll try. but a storm's brewing. He nodded toward the western sky where dark clouds were gathering. Might be our best chance. Another storm? Eleanor couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. The thought of facing more cold, more snow, when she'd barely survived the last one, was almost unbearable. Nature plays no favorites, Mason replied, but she can be an ally if you know her ways. That storm will cover our tracks better than anything we could do. They rested only 15 minutes before Mason insisted they continue. The pace he set was punishing, but Eleanor didn't complain. Each step took them farther from Clearwater and the hatred that festered there. By late afternoon, the first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally and cutting visibility to mere yards. "We need shelter," Mason called over his shoulder, his voice nearly lost in the rising gale. "Can't make the distance I'd hoped." Eleanor didn't answer, saving her breath for the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other. Her world had narrowed to Mason's broad back ahead of her and the endless white beneath her feet. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, Mason stopped so abruptly she nearly collided with him. "Here," he said, pointing to what looked like nothing more than a snow-covered mound. But as they approached, Eleanor saw it was a crude shelter, a three-sided structure built of logs and covered with pine boughs, now heavily laden with snow. "Hunting. Blind," Mason explained, brushing away snow to reveal the entrance. "Built it last fall. The space inside was tight, barely large enough for two people to sit upright, but after the howling wind outside, it felt like a palace." Mason quickly cleared snow from the floor and laid down pine branches for insulation. "We can't risk a fire," he said, helping Eleanor remove her snow-crusted outer layers. "Smoke would lead them straight to us." Instead, he pulled extra blankets from his pack and wrapped one around her shoulders. From a small flask, he poured what looked like water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink," he ordered. "It will warm you from inside." Eleanor took a cautious sip and nearly choked as liquid fire burned down her throat. "What is this?" A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Trappers call it snake medicine. Best not ask what's in it." Whatever it was, it sent warmth spreading through her frozen limbs almost immediately. Eleanor took another small sip, then handed the cup back. "Will they follow us in this?" she asked, as the wind shrieked around their shelter. Mason took a drink, before recapping the flask. "Depends how badly they want you. Sheriff Wilson's no fool. He won't risk men in a mountain storm without good reason." And Jeremiah Porter. His son was one of the children who died. Mason's expression darkened. A grieving man might risk anything. They sat in silence as daylight faded into early dusk, the storm turning the world outside into a formless void. Eleanor found herself intensely aware of Mason beside her, his breathing, the heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him. "You said they call you the Ghost," she said finally. "Why?" Mason didn't answer immediately, and she thought perhaps he hadn't heard over the wind. Then he shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing hers. "After Hannah died, I changed," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. "Spent 2 years learning from a Shoshone hunter who'd lost his family to smallpox. He taught me to move without sound, to read sign most white men never notice, to become part of the forest instead of fighting against it." He paused, and Eleanor sensed there was more to the story than he was telling. "When I came back to civilization, I worked as a scout for the army, found things, people, that others couldn't, got a reputation." "For being a ghost," Eleanor finished. "For appearing where you weren't expected," Mason nodded. "Makes some men nervous, makes others want you on their side." "And which am I?" Eleanor asked softly. In the dimming light, she saw his eyes travel over her face, searching for something. "Neither," he said finally. "You're just someone who deserves better than what the world has given you." The simple statement, delivered without pity or expectation, touched something deep within Eleanor, a place that had remained unbroken despite everything. Before she could respond, Mason stiffened, his head turning toward the entrance of their shelter. "What is it?" she whispered, sudden fear clutching at her throat. Mason held up a hand for silence, his entire body alert as he listened intently. Eleanor strained her ears, but could hear nothing beyond the shrieking wind. After a long moment, Mason relaxed slightly. "Thought I heard something. Probably just a falling branch." But his hand remained on his rifle, and his eyes stayed fixed on the entrance. Eleanor huddled deeper into her blanket, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were. Two people alone in a vast wilderness with enemies at their backs and an unforgiving storm all around. "Try to sleep," Mason said, though he made no move to rest himself. "I'll keep watch." "Will you wake me for my turn?" Eleanor asked, unwilling to be merely a burden. A flicker of surprise crossed Mason's face, quickly replaced by something like respect. "I will," he agreed, "in a few hours." Eleanor doubted she could sleep with danger so close, but exhaustion had other ideas. The rhythmic sound of Mason's breathing and the steady howl of the wind formed an unlikely lullaby, drawing her down into darkness. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that perhaps salvation came in unexpected forms, not as grand rescue or divine intervention, but as a gruff trapper with sad eyes who simply refused to let a stranger die alone in the snow. Eleanor woke with a start, disoriented in the darkness. The wind had died down to a whisper, and the air felt impossibly still after the howling storm. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was she? Then her hand touched Mason's shoulder, solid and warm beside her. "Time," she whispered. "Middle of the night," he replied, his voice low. "Storms past. We should move." "Now?" "In darkness. Best time, moon's high. Snow reflects enough light to see, and they won't expect us to travel at night." The logic was sound, but the thought of venturing into the frozen wilderness in darkness sent a shiver through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the cold. "I've never traveled by night," she admitted. "Stay close. Follow my footsteps exactly." Mason began gathering their few belongings. "Night changes the forest, makes some dangers. Worse, others better." They emerged from the shelter into a transformed world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in silver and shadow. The nearly full moon hung in a clear sky, turning the snow-covered forest into a dreamscape of black trees against white ground. Stars pierced the darkness with unexpected brilliance, more than Eleanor had ever seen. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her words forming clouds in the frigid air. Mason paused in adjusting his pack, looking up at the sky. "My Shoshone teacher called nights like this spirit times. Said the boundary between worlds grows thin when the moon and stars and snow speak together." It was the most poetic thing Eleanor had heard him say, a glimpse of something beyond the unpractical trapper. Before she could respond, Mason had shouldered his pack and was strapping on his snowshoes. "We've got 6 hours till dawn," he said, returning to his usual terseness. "Need to make them count." Traveling by moonlight proved oddly easier than Eleanor expected. The snow reflected enough light to see their path, and the world held a crystalline clarity that daylight often lacked. Mason set a steady pace, not the punishing speed of yesterday, but a rhythm they could maintain for hours. "Tell me about your Shoshone teacher," Eleanor said after they had been walking for some time. The silence of the forest pressed against her, making her crave human connection. Mason was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Then, without breaking stride, "His name was Running Fox. Found me half dead in the mountains after I left the orphanage. I was 16, thought I knew how to survive in the wild." A soft sound that might have been a laugh. "I didn't." "What happened?" "Fell through river ice. Would have frozen if he hadn't been hunting nearby." Mason ducked under a low-hanging branch, heavy with snow. He took me to his winter camp, taught me to live, not just survive. Eleanor carefully followed in his tracks, intrigued by this glimpse into Mason's past. Why did he help you? Again, that long silence. He said the spirit sent me. His family died of the white man's disease. Said he was waiting for someone to pass his knowledge to before joining them in the next world. And you stayed with him 2 years, longest I'd stayed anywhere since Hannah died. Mason's voice held no self-pity, just a simple statement of fact. He died 3 winters ago, went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. Said it was his time. Eleanor thought of her grandmother who had passed the same way, peacefully, on her own terms. He gave you a great gift. The greatest, Mason agreed. Showed me another way to see the world, not just as something to fight against. They walked in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The moon traced its arc across the sky, shadows shifting around them as they made their way through stands of pine and across small meadows buried in snow. By the time the eastern horizon began to lighten, they had covered miles. Mason finally called a halt at the edge of a frozen creek. Need to rest. Eat something, he said, brushing snow from a fallen log. Dawn's the coldest time. Best not to be still for long. Eleanor sank gratefully onto the log, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Mason handed her a strip of dried meat and a small piece of hard bread. Not much farther to the line cabin, he said, studying the lightening sky. Should reach it by midday. Do. You think they're still following? Eleanor asked, chewing the tough meat slowly to make it last. Mason's expression turned grim. Count on it. Sheriff Wilson's a tracker. If the storm didn't throw him off completely, he'll find our trail eventually. Fear, which had receded during their night journey, crept back. Then we keep running? For now. Mason took a drink from his water skin, then offered it to Eleanor. But running isn't a life. Eventually, we stand. The simple declaration carried such quiet certainty that Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Not hope exactly, that seemed too fragile an emotion for their circumstances, but perhaps resolve. What made you become a healer? Mason asked suddenly, the question surprising her after his usual reticence. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the water skin, grateful for even that small warmth. My grandmother. She was a midwife in Virginia. Before moving west with my grandfather, she knew every plant that grew in those mountains, what each one could heal. The memory of Grandmother Sullivan's herb garden came back vividly, rows of carefully tended plants, each with its purpose, its season, its proper harvesting time. She took me gathering from the time I could walk, Eleanor continued, taught me to listen to the plants, to understand when they offered healing and when they warned of danger. And the birthing. Mason's tone held no judgment, only curiosity. That came later. After she died, women still needed help. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride. Eleanor smiled faintly. First baby I delivered alone was the blacksmith's daughter. Her father couldn't fetch help. I was 17 and terrified, and after that I knew it was my calling. Even went to Philadelphia for training with a doctor who believed women should learn medicine. That's where I met Thomas. He was teaching at a school nearby. The pain of Thomas's memory had softened somewhat, allowing her to speak his name without that crushing weight of grief. Mason nodded, absorbing her story. And Clearwater. Thomas wanted to teach in a place that needed him most. We came west 5 years ago. Eleanor's voice hardened slightly. They welcomed us then. Needed a teacher for their children, a midwife for their wives. Until they didn't. Mason stood, offering a hand to help her up. People take what they need, then fear what they don't understand. It's the way of towns. Not all people, Eleanor said, looking up at him. Not you. Something flickered in Mason's grey eyes, a warmth that belied the winter around them. Before he could respond, a sound split the dawn stillness, the distant but unmistakable baying of hounds. Dogs, Eleanor whispered, her body tensing with fear. Mason's face darkened. They've brought trackers, come on. They abandoned any pretense of rest, strapping on snowshoes and setting off at a punishing pace. The forest, so peaceful during their night journey, now seemed filled with menace. Every cracking branch, every flutter of snow from pine boughs sounded like pursuit. The cabin's just beyond that ridge, Mason said an hour later, pointing to a line of hills ahead. But we can't go there now. Dogs will follow our scent straight to it. Then where? Eleanor gasped, struggling to keep up, her strength failing after the long night's travel. Mason's eyes scanned the terrain with the practiced assessment of a man whose life had often depended on reading the land correctly. Water, he decided. Creek's our best chance. He veered sharply to the left, leading them toward the sound of rushing water. The frozen creek they'd rested beside earlier had been just a trickle beneath ice, but now Eleanor heard the unmistakable music of a larger waterway. They broke through the tree line to find a swift-flowing river, its center still running free. Despite the ice forming at its edges, without hesitation, Mason led them into the freezing water, the current tugging at their legs. "Stay in the shallows," he warned. "Follow the edge exactly where I step." The shock of the cold water stole Eleanor's breath. Even through her boots and leggings, it bit like fire against her skin. They waded upstream for what felt like an eternity, each step a battle against both current and cold. Finally, Mason helped her scramble onto a large, flat rock jutting from the riverbank. "Rest here. Don't move." He disappeared back into the water, leaving Eleanor shivering violently on the stone. She watched in confusion as he backtracked, carefully erasing any sign of their exit from the river by smoothing over the disturbed snow and breaking ice into the current. When he returned, he lifted her to her feet. "This way. Step exactly where I step. Only on stone or bare ground." They picked their way along the rocky riverbank for another quarter-mile before Mason finally allowed them to turn back into the forest. By then, Eleanor's feet had lost all feeling, and her hands were stiff claws inside her mittens. Can't feel my toes," she stammered through chattering teeth. Mason looked at her with concern, noting the bluish tinge to her lips. Without a word, he swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her through the deep snow. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have protested. Now she could only press her face against his chest, seeking any warmth she could find. "Cabins." "Just ahead," Mason murmured. "Hold on." Through frost-rimmed lashes, Eleanor saw a small structure materialize among the trees, a simple log cabin with a stone chimney nearly invisible against the backdrop of pines until they were almost upon it. Mason kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her gently on a rough wooden bench. The cabin was cold, but offered blessed shelter from the wind that had begun to rise again. "Need to get you warm," he said, immediately moving to the stone fireplace where wood had been stacked in preparation for his eventual return. "And dry. Wet clothes will kill you faster than any bullet." His matter-of-fact efficiency kept panic at bay as Eleanor watched him work. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth a distant promise against her bone-deep chill. "Can you undress yourself?" Mason asked, his back turned as he hung a kettle of snow over the growing flames. Eleanor tried to unfasten her coat, but her fingers refused to cooperate, numb and useless against the buttons. "I can't," she admitted, humiliation burning her. Cheeks despite the cold, Mason faced her, his expression all business. "I need to help you, or you'll lose fingers and toes to frostbite." He hesitated, then added more gently, "I'll be respectful, healer to patient." Eleanor nodded once, giving permission. With surprising delicacy for such large hands, Mason helped her remove her frozen outer clothes. He worked quickly, clinically, with the detached manner of a doctor rather than a man undressing a woman. When she sat in only her borrowed shift, he wrapped her in thick furs and settled her near the fire. "Drink this," he ordered, pressing a tin cup of steaming liquid into her hands once they had regained enough function to hold it. "Pine needle tea, not pleasant, but it'll help." The tea was indeed bitter, but the heat of it spread through Eleanor's core, beginning the slow process of warming her from within. As feeling returned to her extremities, it brought the expected pain, sharp and burning as circulation resumed. Mason knelt before her, taking each of her feet in turn to examine for frostbite. His touch was gentle as he checked her toes, rubbing them carefully to restore blood flow. "You'll keep them all," he finally pronounced. "No blackening." "Thank you," Eleanor said, the words wholly inadequate for what he had done, not just saving her from the cold, but preserving her dignity in vulnerability. Mason merely nodded, then set about hanging their wet clothes to dry around the growing fire. The cabin gradually warmed, revealing itself to be a single room with minimal comforts. A narrow bed built into one wall, a rough table with 2 stools, shelves stocked with basic provisions. "It's not much," Mason said, following her gaze. "Around the space, just a way station when I'm running trap lines." "It's wonderful," Eleanor replied honestly. After weeks of near-death cold, the simple shelter seemed luxurious. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the trees and rattling the cabin's single window. Eleanor strained to hear any sound of pursuit, but detected nothing beyond the normal noises of the forest. "The dogs?" she asked. "River should have thrown them off," Mason said, though his expression remained watchful. "Water washes away the scent, and we've got another storm coming." He gestured toward the window where snow had begun to fall again. "Nature is helping us once more." The immediate danger having passed, exhaustion crashed over Eleanor like a wave. She struggled to keep her eyes open, warmth and relative safety conspiring to pull her toward sleep. Mason noticed her fighting to stay awake. "Rest," he said, his voice gentler than she'd yet heard it. "I'll keep watch." This time, Eleanor didn't argue. Cocooned in furs before the fire, she surrendered to sleep, trusting this quiet, capable man to guard her safety. It was a trust she hadn't expected to feel again after Clearwater's betrayal, yet here it was, fragile but real. Mason watched Eleanor sleep, noting how the lines of fear and exhaustion gradually smoothed from her face. In slumber, she looked younger, the woman she might have been without tragedy, carving its marks into her features. He added another log to the fire, careful not to make noise that might disturb her rest. Outside, the snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring the world beyond the cabin's walls. Good weather for hiding, bad for traveling. They would need to stay put until it passed. As the day progressed into evening, Mason moved quietly around them. Small space, taking inventory of supplies, checking sightlines through the window, always keeping one ear tuned to the forest beyond. No sound of dogs had reached them since their river crossing, but experience had taught him that danger rarely announced its arrival. Eleanor stirred as darkness fell, her eyes opening to find the cabin bathed in the golden glow of firelight. Mason had lit an oil lamp on the table where he sat cleaning his rifle, the familiar ritual of wiping and oiling each part, a meditation of sorts. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, her voice rough with rest. "All day," Mason replied, glancing up. "In from his work." "You needed it." Eleanor sat up, keeping the furs wrapped around her. Her clothes, now dry, had been neatly folded on a stool near the fire. "Any sign of pursuit?" Mason shook his head. "Nothing. Storm's heavy. Even the best tracker would lose our trail now." Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by a more immediate concern. "Is there water to wash?" Melted snow in that basin, Mason said, nodding toward a corner where he'd placed a wooden bowl and a scrap of cloth that served as a towel. St. Giles, step outside. Give you privacy. Before Eleanor could protest that he needn't go out into the storm, Mason had pulled on his coat and slipped through the door, closing it firmly behind him. The simple courtesy brought unexpected tears to her eyes. After weeks of being treated as less than human, as a thing to be feared and destroyed, Mason's consistent respect felt like water to parched soil. She washed quickly in the cold water, grateful to remove days of travel grime, then dressed in her borrowed clothes, now toasty warm from the fireside. By the time Mason returned, snow dusting his shoulders and beard, she was seated at the table, using a wooden comb she'd found to work the tangles from her long hair. Mason stomped snow from his boots, then hung his coat on a peg by the door. Without comment, he moved to the fire and lifted a pot that had been simmering at its edge. "Stew," he said, ladling the contents into 2 wooden bowls. "Nothing fancy, just what was stored here." "It smells wonderful," Eleanor said honestly, her stomach growling at the aroma of meat and vegetables. They ate in companionable silence, the stew simple but nourishing after days of dried meat and hard bread. When they finished, Mason produced a small pouch of coffee beans from his supplies, grinding them carefully before adding them to the boiling water. "Real coffee," Eleanor said with delight, when he handed her a steaming cup. "I haven't had this since Clearwater," Mason supplied when she trailed off. Eleanor nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Thomas loved coffee. Said he couldn't think properly without it. Your husband sounds like he was a good man." "He was kind, gentle." Eleanor's voice softened with memory. "Not built for the frontier, really, but he believed in what he was doing, bringing education to children who would otherwise have none." Mason sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "And did you believe in what you were doing?" "With all my heart," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Every baby I delivered, every fever I broke, every pain I eased, it mattered, it was good work. Until they decided it wasn't." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Until a sickness came that I couldn't cure, and they needed someone to blame. Easier to blame a woman than accept that some things can't be controlled," Mason observed. "Especially a woman who lives slightly apart, who knows things they don't understand." Eleanor set down her cup, meeting his gaze directly. "But you do understand, don't you, because of your sister?" Mason's eyes darkened with old pain. "Hannah was brilliant, could look at a plant and know its properties just by the way it grew, the shape of its leaves. Our mother taught her some, but most of it came naturally to her." "A gift," Eleanor said softly. "That's what turned against her. Town needed her skills until they feared them." Mason's hand tightened around his cup. "She was 17 when they hanged her. I was 14. Too young, too small to stop them." The raw pain in his voice echoed Eleanor's own losses. Without thinking, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. "It wasn't your fault." Mason didn't pull away from her touch. "I know that. In my head." He tapped his temple with his free hand. "But here." He pressed his fist against his chest. "Here, I still wonder what I could have done differently." "All carry those wounds," Eleanor said quietly. "The what-ifs, the might-have-beens." Outside, the wind moaned around the cabin's eaves, a lonely sound in the gathering night. Inside, 2 people who had lost everything found an unexpected connection in shared grief, in mutual understanding no explanation could capture. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked finally, voicing the question that had hovered unspoken between them. Mason's eyes met hers, steady and clear in the lamplight. "We rest, regain strength, then we decide, together, where to go next. And if they find us before then we face them," Mason said simply. "But not as victims. Not this time." In his quiet certainty, Eleanor found something she'd thought lost forever in that terrible night when Clearwater turned against her. A sense of possibility. Not safety, not yet, but the chance of it, shimmering on the horizon like distant lamplight, seen through a storm. 3 days passed in the relative safety of the line cabin. The storm that had masked their escape turned into a full blizzard, burying the forest under fresh feet of snow and making travel impossible even for the most determined pursuers. During those days, Eleanor regained strength she'd thought permanently lost. The regular meals, though simple, filled out the hollows in her cheeks. Sleep came easier each night, unmarred by the nightmares that had plagued her since Clearwater. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke to find Mason already dressed, peering. Through the cabin's frosted window, "Storm's broken," he said without turning. "Clear skies." Eleanor joined him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Outside, the world sparkled under a brilliant blue sky, the snow-laden branches catching the morning light like thousands of prisms. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "And dangerous," Mason replied. "Clear weather means they can move again. We should too." Disappointment flickered through Eleanor. The cabin had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could almost forget they were fugitives. "Where will we go?" she asked, moving away to fold the blankets on her makeshift bed near the hearth. Mason had insisted on taking the floor, giving her the cabin's narrow bunk. "North and west," Mason said, returning to practical matters. "There's a settlement near the mountains, Crooked Pine. Small place, mostly trappers and hunters, few questions asked." "Will we be safe there?" Mason's expression was guarded. "Safer than here. After that, there's a place beyond the pass. Valley. Sheltered from winter storms. An old trapper I knew built a cabin there years back, said I could use it if I ever needed to disappear." The idea of disappearing, of leaving behind the world that had rejected her, held undeniable appeal. Yet, Eleanor felt a tug of reluctance. To disappear meant giving up on the life she'd built, the skills she'd honed, the service she'd offered. "I've never been further west than Clearwater," she admitted. "Thomas and I always meant to see the mountains, but there was always another season of teaching, another woman needing birthing help." "Mountains will still be there," Mason said, misinterpreting her hesitation as concern about the journey. "We'll take it slow, build your strength as we go." Eleanor nodded, not correcting his assumption. How could she explain the strange mix of fear and anticipation battling within her? The world beyond Clearwater was unknown territory in more ways than one. They packed their few belongings efficiently, having developed an easy rhythm in their days together. Mason checked his rifle and ammunition, while Eleanor prepared food for the journey, wrapping smoked venison and hard biscuits in oilcloth. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Mason carefully swept away evidence of their stay, a habit Eleanor had noticed before, leaving no trace, becoming a ghost that passed through without disturbance. 2 days to Crooked Pine if the weather holds," he said as they strapped on snowshoes outside the cabin. "We'll stay there only long enough to get supplies, then push on to the high country." Eleanor adjusted her pack, surprised at how much stronger she felt compared to their last journey. "I'm ready." And she was, not just physically, but mentally. Something had shifted during their days in the cabin. The crushing grief and fear that had dominated her existence since Clearwater had receded, making room for a cautious resilience. They traveled steadily through the day, following game trails, when possible, breaking their own path when necessary. Mason set a reasonable pace, neither too fast nor too slow, matching his longer stride to Eleanor's shorter one without comment. By late afternoon, they came to a ridge overlooking a broad valley. Mason paused, studying the landscape with the trappers. "Keen eye. Smoke," he said, pointing to a distant wisp rising against the mountains. "Not a campfire. Too steady." Eleanor squinted against the glare of sun on snow. A settlement? No. Wrong direction for Crooked Pine. Mason's brow furrowed. Could be a hunting party, or a prospector's cabin. Is that usual? People living out here? Less usual than it once was. Mason continued to study the smoke, something in his posture alerting Eleanor to his concern. Gold Strike 20 miles south has drawn most free spirits that way. This valley should be empty this time of year. They stood in silence, both sensing that this unexpected sign of human presence required careful consideration. We should avoid it, Eleanor suggested. Go around. Mason nodded slowly. Normally, yes, but... He hesitated, weighing options. Storms left deep snow. Going around means adding a day, maybe two, through more exposed terrain. And if whoever's there is unfriendly, then we deal with it, Mason said simply. But a trapper might have news. Whether Sheriff Wilson's still searching, how far his reach extends. The practical value of information is balanced against the risk of discovery. Eleanor understood the calculation, even as anxiety fluttered in her chest. You decide, she said finally. I trust your judgment. Something flickered in Mason's eyes at her declaration of trust. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. He nodded once, decision made. We approach each other carefully. If anything feels wrong, we withdraw immediately. They descended into the valley as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Mason led them on a route that utilized natural cover, stands of pine, rock outcroppings, folds in the terrain, approaching the source of smoke obliquely rather than directly. As they drew nearer, the landscape told its own story, broken branches where someone had gathered firewood in haste rather than with care. Multiple sets of tracks converging on a small cabin, partially sheltered by a granite cliff face. Mason halted them in a thicket of spruce 100 yards from the cabin. Wait here, he murmured, slipping his rifle from its sheath. I'll scout. Closer. Before Eleanor could protest, he had vanished among the trees, moving with the silent grace that had earned him his ghostly reputation. She crouched in the shelter of the spruce, straining to track his progress, but even knowing where to look, she quickly lost sight of him against the backdrop of snow and shadow. The minutes stretched endlessly. The lowering sun cast the valley in deepening blue, stealing warmth and light with each passing moment. Eleanor's breath clouded before her face as she waited, muscles tense with readiness for whatever signal might come. A sound, so faint she might have imagined it, drew her. Attention to the right. Mason materialized beside her, his expression grim. 4 men, he whispered, not hunters or trappers. City clothes under trail gear, and they've got a woman with them. Eleanor's pulse quickened. A prisoner. Not tied, but not free either. She's sick or injured. They've got her in a back room. Did they see you? Mason shook his head. I know how to stay hidden. Eleanor processed this information, healer's instincts warring with caution. If she's sick, I might help. It's not our concern, Mason replied, though without conviction. We need to move on before dark. What if she dies because we walked away? Eleanor countered softly. Could you live with that? The question hung between them in the cold air. Mason's jaw worked beneath his beard as he weighed their options. It's dangerous, he said finally. These men, something's not right about them. They're armed, nervous. All the more reason that woman might need help, Eleanor insisted. If they're not hunters or trappers, what are they doing out here? Mason's expression darkened. Nothing good. He studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. We'll watch until dark. If an opportunity comes to learn more without endangering ourselves, we'll take it. Otherwise, we move on. It was a reasonable compromise. Eleanor nodded agreement, settling in for an uncomfortable wait as daylight faded and temperatures plummeted. As dusk deepened into true darkness, activity around the cabin increased. Two men emerged, arguing in low voices as they fetched more firewood. A third appeared briefly at the doorway, silhouetted against the interior light, before disappearing back inside. "Something's happening," Mason whispered. "They're agitated." Almost in answer to his observation, the cabin door burst open, spilling golden lamplight across the snow. A man staggered out, clutching something in his arms, a bundle that moved weakly. "The woman," Eleanor gasped. The man half carried, half dragged, his burden to a separate structure, a crude lean-to that might once have sheltered animals or supplies. He deposited his burden roughly inside, then hurried back to the main cabin, slamming the door behind him. "They've put her outside," Eleanor said, horror coloring her voice. "In this cold!" Mason's expression had hardened into something dangerous. "Because she's dying, or they think she is." "She will if left out there," Eleanor said with certainty born of frontier experience. "No one survives a winter night exposed." "Which means they don't expect her to survive," Mason concluded grimly. "And don't want her dying inside their shelter." The implications hung unspoken between them. These men had brought a woman to this isolated place, and now that she was gravely ill, they had cast her out to die alone. A calculated act of callousness that spoke volumes about their character. Eleanor felt resolve harden within her, like iron. "I'm going to her." Mason caught her arm. "It's too dangerous." "If they see you, they won't," Eleanor countered, surprising herself with her certainty. "They're inside, distracted. The lean-to is in shadow from the cabin. I can reach her unseen." "And do what?" "We can't bring her with us. I can at least see what ails her, maybe help ease her passing, if nothing else." The words came from the healer who still lived within her, the woman who had sworn to ease suffering wherever she found it. Mason studied her face in the dim starlight, reading her determination. "I'll create a distraction if needed," he said. "Finally, be ready to retreat at my signal." Eleanor squeezed his hand in silent gratitude, then began her careful approach. She moved as Mason had taught her over their days together, stepping silently, utilizing every shadow, becoming part of the night rather than an intruder within it. The lean-to stood 20 yards from the main cabin, its ramshackle walls offering minimal shelter from the elements. As Eleanor drew closer, she heard labored breathing, the unmistakable rattle of lungs struggling for air. She slipped inside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness. A figure lay huddled on a thin pallet of straw, shivering violently, despite the blanket thrown carelessly over her. "Hello," Eleanor whispered, keeping her voice barely audible. "I'm here to help." The woman started, a small sound of fear escaping her lips. "Shh," Eleanor soothed, kneeling beside her. "I won't hurt you. I'm a healer." In the faint light filtering through cracks in the walls, Eleanor could make out a young face, perhaps 20 years old, flushed with fever. The woman's eyes were glassy, unfocused as they sought the source of the voice. "Angel," she rasped, her voice cracked and dry. "No, just a woman," Eleanor replied gently, laying her palm against the burning forehead. "You're very sick. How long have you had this fever?" The woman's eyes drifted closed, then opened with visible effort. "Days. Not sure. They took me from the wagon train. Said they'd help me find my brother in the gold fields." Each word seemed to cost her tremendous effort. Eleanor's heart contracted with a mixture of pity and rage. The story was clear enough. A vulnerable young woman separated from her protection, lured away by predators with false promises. "What's your name?" she asked, already examining what she could in the darkness. The fever was dangerously high, the breathing labored. Pneumonia most likely, brought on by exposure and exhaustion. "Sarah," came the whispered reply. "Sarah Mitchell." "I'm Eleanor. I'm going to try to help you, Sarah, but I need to know more about your illness." As gently as possible, Eleanor questioned the young woman, piecing together what had happened. Sarah had been traveling with a wagon train bound for Oregon when she'd met these men at a trading post. They'd convinced her they knew a shortcut to the gold fields where her brother worked, promising to reunite her with her only remaining family. Once isolated, their true intentions became clear. Sarah had fallen ill 3 days ago, her condition worsening until they'd finally abandoned her to die. "Need willow bark," Eleanor muttered to herself, mentally reviewing what herbs might be found even in winter. "And pine needle tea for the cough, something for strength." A shadow darkened the entrance to the lean-to. Eleanor tensed, reaching for the knife Mason had given her, only to relax when she recognized his broad outline. "How bad?" he asked softly, crouching beside her. "Very," Eleanor replied. "Pneumonia, I think, and she's been mistreated." Mason's expression hardened, his eyes flicking toward the main cabin where raucous laughter now sounded. "Can you help her?" "Maybe. I need herbs. Some might be found nearby. Others—" Eleanor hesitated. "I had a medicine pouch in my pack." The pouch contained dried herbs she'd managed to gather during their days at the line cabin, small amounts, but better than nothing. Eleanor had harvested them out of habit, her healer's instinct to collect medicinal plants never fully suppressed even in her own desperate circumstances. Mason nodded once, slipping back into the night. Minutes later he returned with her pack and a small container of water. "They're occupied," he reported, "drinking, but that won't last all night." Eleanor worked quickly, steeping dried willow bark in water to reduce fever, preparing a poultice. For Sarah's chest from pine resin, Mason gathered from nearby trees. The treatments were rudimentary, lacking the full range of remedies Eleanor would normally employ, but they were better than abandonment. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as Eleanor tended her, occasionally murmuring her brother's name, or fragments of prayer. The fever showed no immediate signs of breaking, but her breathing eased somewhat after the poultice was applied. "We can't leave her here," Eleanor said finally, sitting back on her heels. "She'll die before morning." Mason's gaze was troubled in the darkness. "We can't take her with us. She can't travel, and we'd be carrying a dying woman across miles of wilderness." "Then I'll stay with her," Eleanor decided, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice, "just until the crisis passes. A day, maybe 2. And if those men discover you, then I'll deal with that if it happens." Mason was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "I won't leave you," he said finally. "If you stay, I stay." The simple declaration warmed Eleanor more than any fire could have. "We need better shelter," she said, turning to practical matters. "This lean-to is hardly better than being outside." "There's a hollow about 100 yards east," Mason replied. "Under a fallen cedar, natural windbreak. I could make it habitable." "Can we move her that far?" Mason studied the sick woman, assessing. "I'll carry her. You gather what supplies you can. We'll need to be gone before those men stir." The plan formed quickly between them, the easy coordination of 2 people who had learned to trust each other's judgment. Mason would prepare the new shelter, while Eleanor administered what treatment she could. Then, in the coldest hour before dawn, when sleep was deepest, they would move Sarah to safety. As Mason slipped away to begin his work, Eleanor turned back to her patient, offering sips of the bitter willow bark tea. "My friend and I are going to help you," she murmured. "But you need to be strong. Fight this fever. Your brother is waiting for you." Sarah's eyes flickered open, more lucid than before. "Why?" she whispered. "Why help me? You don't know me." Eleanor smiled faintly, remembering Mason asking her a similar question about what felt like a lifetime ago. "Because it's what makes us human," she replied simply. "Caring for each other when the world turns cold." Hours passed in watchful waiting. Eleanor administered what remedies she had, monitoring Sarah's breathing and pulse for signs of improvement or decline. Outside, the temperature dropped further, stars burning with cold fire in a cloudless sky. Shortly before the appointed hour, Mason returned, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "It's ready," he whispered. "Not comfortable, but warm. Hidden." Eleanor nodded, gathering her few possessions. The men? Still inside, drinking heavily. His expression darkened. "Heard enough to know these aren't men we want to meet. Deserters from the army turned to robbery and worse." The confirmation of Sarah's story only strengthened Eleanor's resolve. "Let's get her out of here." With gentle efficiency, Mason lifted the sick woman, blankets and all, cradling her against his chest to share his body warmth. Sarah moaned softly, but didn't fully wake, her illness keeping her mercifully unaware of the dangerous transfer. They moved through the night like shadows, Eleanor following Mason's silent lead, away from the cabin and into the deeper forest. The fallen cedar appeared as a darker shape against the snow-covered ground, its massive trunk creating a natural wall beside a hollow scooped from the earth. Mason had transformed this natural depression into a rudimentary shelter, boughs laid, in a thick mat over the ground, more arranged in a roof-like structure against the cedar trunk, a small fire burning in a pit dug deep enough that its light wouldn't be visible from a distance. "It's perfect," Eleanor breathed as they ducked inside. "It'll do for now," Mason replied, carefully settling Sarah onto the pine bough bed, "until we decide our next move." The words hung between them, pregnant with implications. Their carefully planned journey to Crooked Pine and beyond had been delayed, perhaps derailed entirely by this unexpected encounter. Yet neither voiced regret at their decision. As dawn lightened the eastern sky, Eleanor tended her patient while Mason kept watch from a position that offered clear sightlines to the cabin. Sarah's fever still raged, but her breathing had eased somewhat, offering a slender hope that the pneumonia might yield to treatment. "Movement at the cabin," Mason reported, ducking back into their shelter. "They've discovered she's gone, Eleanor's, and stilled in the act of preparing more willow bark tea. Will they search? Maybe. Depends how much they care if she lives or dies." Mason's expression was grim. "My guess is they'll assume she wandered off in delirium. Might look nearby, but not for long. And if they find our trail?" Mason's hand moved to his rifle, a gesture that needed no explanation. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." The day passed in tense vigilance. Twice they spotted men from the cabin moving through the forest, calling Sarah's name with false concern that didn't mask the underlying anger in their voices. Each time, Mason and Eleanor froze in absolute stillness, barely daring to breathe, until the danger passed. By afternoon, the searches had stopped. By evening, smoke still rose from the cabin chimney, but no further activity could be observed. "They've given up," Mason concluded, "probably convinced themselves she died in the woods. Easier on whatever conscience they have left." Eleanor nodded, relief mingling with continued concern for her patient. Sarah's condition remained critical, the fever stubbornly persistent, despite Eleanor's best efforts. "We should leave at first." "Light," Mason said, watching Eleanor check Sarah's pulse. "Those men could decide to move on, and we don't want to be caught in the open when they do." "She can't travel yet," Eleanor replied, not looking up. "The fever hasn't broken." "She'll die if we try to move her now." Eleanor hesitated, weighing medical certainty against their precarious situation. Not necessarily die, but it would worsen her condition significantly, reduce her chances. Mason was silent, the dilemma clear. Staying put risked discovery by dangerous men. Moving risked Sarah's life. Neither option offered safety. "One more day," he said finally. "If the fever hasn't broken by tomorrow night, we will move anyway. Head straight for Crooked Pine and find the doctor there." It was a reasonable compromise. Eleanor nodded agreement, turning back to her patient with renewed determination. As night fell once more, bringing the bone-deep cold of mountain winter, Eleanor found herself watching Mason as he tended their small fire. His profile in the flickering light was strong, dependable, a man carved by hardship into something unbreakable. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for staying, for helping her when it would have been safer to walk away." Mason looked up, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something more complex. "You're changing me," he said quietly, "making me remember there's more to life than just surviving." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Eleanor, a place that had begun to heal under his steady presence. Before she could respond, Sarah stirred on her makeshift bed, a low moan escaping her lips. Eleanor turned to her, patient, laying a hand on the fevered brow. "Water," Sarah rasped, more coherent than she'd been since they found her. As Eleanor held a cup to the young woman's parched lips, she felt something shift beneath her supporting hand, a subtle cooling of skin that had burned for days. "Mason," she called softly, "the fever's breaking." He moved to her side, studying Sarah's face in the firelight. "She'll live, if we're careful, if infection doesn't set in." Eleanor couldn't keep a smile from spreading across her face. "But yes, I think she'll live." The relief that washed over Mason's features mirrored her own, not just for Sarah's sake, but for what it represented. In the midst of their own desperate flight, they had found the capacity to save another. It was a small victory against the cruelty that had driven them both from their homes, a reminder that even in darkness, light could be kindled. Outside their sheltered hollow, the forest stood silent under the cold stars, indifferent to human struggles. Inside, 3 outcasts huddled against the wilderness, one healing, one protecting, one beginning to believe that a future beyond mere survival might still be possible. What none of them realized, as they took comfort in this moment of hard-won peace, was that the true danger was yet to come, approaching not from the cabin of desperate men, but from the direction they had fled, where Sheriff Wilson had picked up their trail once more, driven by a hatred that no storm could deter. The first hints of dawn filtered through the pine boughs overhead as Eleanor checked Sarah's forehead. The fever had continued to recede through the night, leaving the young woman weak but conscious, her eyes clear for the first time since they'd found her. "We'll move today," Eleanor explained softly, helping Sarah sip from a cup of pine needle tea. "There's a settlement not far from here, a place called Crooked Pine." Sarah nodded weakly. "Thank you. I don't understand why strangers would help me, but thank you." Before Eleanor could respond, Mason appeared at the entrance to their hidden shelter, his expression grim. "They're gone," he reported. "The men from the cabin left before first light, heading east." "That's good news, isn't it?" Eleanor asked, noting the tension in his posture. Mason shook his head. "They're not alone on the trail. Spotted tracks coming. From the south, 6 riders moving fast." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter morning ran through Eleanor. "Sheriff Wilson?" "Almost certainly. The deserters probably ran into his search party, told them about a woman gone missing from their camp." Mason's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Wilson's no fool. He'll put it together." Eleanor glanced at Sarah, calculating. The young woman was stronger, but nowhere near ready for a difficult journey. "How much time do we have?" "Hours, not days," Mason replied. "They were still a fair distance when I spotted them, but moving with purpose. A decision needed to be made quickly." Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Sarah can't travel fast, but we can't leave her?" "No," Mason agreed, surprising her. "We've come this far with her." What went unspoken between them was the knowledge that helping Sarah had likely cost them their head start, the precious time they'd gained during the blizzard now lost. Yet neither suggested abandoning her. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice small with renewed fear. Eleanor squeezed her hand reassuringly. People are coming who might make trouble for us. We need to move quickly. With efficient movements born of practice, they broke camp, Mason erasing all signs of their presence, while Eleanor prepared Sarah for travel. The young woman was still, too weak to walk any distance. But Mason had fashioned a simple travois from fallen branches, a sledge that could be pulled over snow. "It's not elegant," he apologized as he helped Sarah onto the pine bough padding, securing her with blankets. "But it will get you to Crooked Pine." By the time the sun had fully crested the horizon, they were moving through the forest, Mason pulling the travois with a strength that made the task look effortless, Eleanor walking alongside to steady it over rough terrain. Their pace was necessarily slower than before, but they made steady progress northward, away from the riders Mason had spotted. "Who are these men following you?" Sarah asked, after they'd traveled in silence for some time. Her voice was stronger, though each word still cost her effort. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Mason, weighing how much to share. "I was accused of witchcraft," she said finally, deciding the truth was simpler than evasion. "For using herbal remedies to heal. When children died despite my efforts, the town turned against me." Sarah's eyes widened. "Like the Salem trials. I thought those days were past." "Fear doesn't die easily," Mason said over his shoulder, never breaking stride, "especially on the frontier where life is precarious." "So you're running from the law?" Sarah asked, no judgment in her tone. "Running from injustice," Eleanor corrected gently. "The law can be twisted when fear rules men's hearts." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Then I'm doubly in your debt," she said finally. "You risked your freedom to help me." "Freedom means little if we abandon our humanity to keep it," Eleanor replied, the words coming from a place of certainty she hadn't known she still possessed. They traveled through the morning and into early afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest and take water. The landscape gradually changed, the dense forest giving way to more open terrain, with scattered stands of pine and occasional rocky outcroppings. "Crooked Pine is beyond that ridge," Mason said during one such rest, pointing to a line of hills. "Ahead. Another 4 hours at this pace." Eleanor nodded, trying to ignore the growing unease that prickled between her shoulder blades. They had made good time despite Sarah's condition, but the sense of pursuit had become a constant companion, an invisible pressure urging them forward. "Do you think we'll make it before they catch up?" she asked quietly, moving away from Sarah, who had drifted into an exhausted sleep. Mason's eyes met hers, direct and honest as always. "Hard to say. If they followed our exact trail, they'd have gained significant ground. But the snow's patchy here, harder to track. And if they do catch up, then we face them," Mason said, the same answer he'd given days ago. "But on ground of our choosing, not theirs." The simple confidence in his voice steadied Eleanor's nerves. They weren't helpless fugitives anymore. They were survivors who had made choices, who had helped others, who had reclaimed their humanity from those who would deny it. They resumed their journey, each step bringing them closer to Crooked Pine and whatever measure of safety it might offer. The afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the snow, the mountains to the west glowing golden as day began its slow surrender to evening. They were traversing a narrow defile between two rocky slopes when Mason suddenly halted, his posture alert as a wolf scenting danger. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered, moving to his side. "Listen," he replied, his voice barely audible. At first, Eleanor heard nothing but the soft sighing of wind through pine boughs. Then carried on that same wind, the distant but unmistakable sound of men's voices, the creak of saddle leather, the snort of horses. "The South Trail," Mason murmured, pointing to a path that intersected their own a quarter-mile ahead. "They're cutting across to intercept us." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "How did they know?" "They didn't. It's the logical route to Crooked Pine." Mason's mind worked rapidly, weighing options. We need to leave the main trail, find cover. Sarah had awakened, fear plain on her pale face. What's happening? Riders approaching, Eleanor explained, trying to keep her voice calm. We need to hide. Mason was already scanning the terrain, his experienced eyes finding what others might miss. There, he decided, pointing to a jumble of massive boulders that had tumbled from the ridge above in some long-ago rockslide. Natural fortress. Defensible? They altered course immediately, Mason pulling the travois with renewed urgency across the open ground toward the shelter of the rocks. Eleanor helped where she could, her own strength tested by the rough terrain and the growing weight of fear. By the time they reached the boulder field, the voices had grown louder, though still out of sight beyond a curve in the trail. Mason helped Sarah from the travois and up into a natural crevice between two massive stones, a space invisible from the trail, but with clear sightlines out. Stay absolutely silent, he instructed, helping Eleanor up beside the sick woman. No matter what you hear. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked, sudden dread gripping her. Mason checked his rifle with practiced movements. Try to turn them around before they find us. That's too dangerous, Eleanor protested. There are 6 of them, and they don't know these rocks like I do now, Mason countered. I won't engage unless necessary, but if it comes to that, he met her eyes steadily. Better me alone than all of us cornered. Before Eleanor could argue further, he squeezed her hand once, then melted into the boulder field with the silent movement that had earned him his ghostly reputation. Minutes stretched like hours as Eleanor and Sarah huddled in their stone redoubt, barely daring to breathe. The riders drew steadily closer, their voices becoming distinct enough to make out words. Tracks lead this way for certain, came a voice Eleanor recognized with a chill. Sheriff Wilson, unchanged from that terrible night at Mason's cabin. The trapper knows these mountains, but snow doesn't lie. Could be anyone's tracks, argued another voice. Plenty of folks use these trails. Not pulling something heavy, Wilson countered. Those drag marks are distinctive, and those deserters, mentioned a woman gone missing from their camp, fits too well to be coincidence. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Just as Mason had feared, Wilson had pieced together what happened, using the deserter's story to confirm his suspicions. The riders came into view on the trail below their hiding place. 6 men on hardy mountain ponies, rifles across their saddles, determination etched on weather-beaten faces. Sheriff Wilson rode at their head, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. Spread out, he ordered. Check both sides of the trail. They can't be far ahead. The men dismounted, tethering their horses to stunted pines that grew alongside the path. They began to move forward on foot, eyes scanning the terrain for signs of passage. Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the rocks, one arm around Sarah, who trembled with fear beside her. If the men conducted a thorough search of the boulder field, discovery was inevitable. A sharp crack split the silence. A rifle shot from somewhere to the north. The men on the trail froze, then ducked for cover, weapons at the ready. "Who's there?" Sheriff Wilson called, his voice echoing against the rocky slopes. Another shot answered him, this one kicking up snow near the sheriff's feet. A warning, not an attempt to hit. "That's far enough, Wilson." Mason's voice carried clearly from the rocks, though Eleanor couldn't see where he'd positioned himself. "Turn back now." The sheriff's face hardened with recognition. "Blackridge, we know you've got the Sullivan woman. This doesn't need to end badly." "Doesn't need to continue at all," Mason replied. "She's under my protection." "You've got no jurisdiction. This far north anyway." Wilson spat into the snow. "Jurisdiction be damned. I've got a warrant for a witch who caused the deaths of innocent children. Stand aside or be charged with harboring a fugitive." "Those children died of tainted water from the mine upstream," Mason called back. "Same sickness that's probably spreading through Clearwater even now, without her there to blame." A murmur passed through the posse at these words. Eleanor realized with a jolt that Mason was sowing doubt, using what she'd told him about the illness to undermine Wilson's certainty. Lies, the sheriff snapped, but with less conviction. The Sullivan woman practiced dark arts. The pastor himself confirmed it. Did he now? Mason's voice took on an edge of contempt. The same pastor? Who takes money from the mining company? Ask your men if they've noticed more sickness since she left, not less. More murmuring among the posse members. One man spoke up, addressing the sheriff directly. My sister's boy took ill just last week, Sheriff. Same symptoms as the Henderson children, and my wife said the creek waters had a strange smell lately, added another, metallic-like. Sheriff Wilson's authority visibly wavered as his men began to question the very foundation of their pursuit. The moment hung in the balance, the outcome uncertain. Then fate intervened in the form most unexpected. Sarah, overtaken by a coughing fit she could no longer suppress, the sound carrying clearly in the tense silence. Wilson's head snapped toward the source of the sound. There, he shouted, pointing toward their hiding place. Get them! Everything happened with brutal speed after that. Two men rushed toward the boulders while Wilson and the others provided covering fire. Mason's rifle cracked again, sending one attacker diving for cover, but the second managed to scramble up the rocks, drawing close to where Eleanor and Sarah hid. Eleanor made a split-second decision. Pushing Sarah deeper into the crevice, she emerged into the open, hands raised. Stop! She called, her voice carrying across the rocky terrain. Stop this madness! The shooting ceased abruptly at her appearance. For a heartbeat, utter silence fell over the scene. Sheriff Wilson and his men staring up at the woman they'd pursued for weeks. Mason, somewhere unseen among the rocks with his rifle still at the ready. Mrs. Sullivan, Wilson said finally, an ugly smile spreading across his face. Your witch's luck has run out. I'm no witch, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. I'm a healer who tried to save children poisoned by the mine that lines your pockets, Sheriff. Wilson's smile faltered. You'll hang for what you did. What exactly did I do? Eleanor challenged, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. Try to heal the sick. Use plants and knowledge passed down through generations. Is that witchcraft? In your eyes, you have a devil's mark, Wilson retorted, though with less certainty than before. I have a birthmark, Eleanor corrected, her hand moving to the crescent behind her ear, the same my mother had and her mother before her. Women who healed, who brought life into the world, who eased suffering. The men of the posse shifted uncomfortably, several exchanging glances that spoke of growing doubt. These were frontier men who understood hardship and injustice, who might follow orders but weren't immune to reason. She saved a dying woman. Mason's voice came from closer now as he emerged from behind a boulder, rifle still ready but not aimed directly at anyone. While you were chasing ghosts, she was healing someone abandoned by murderers and thieves. Who? One of the posse members asked. As if in answer, Sarah appeared at the edge of the rocky shelter, pale but determined. Me, she called weakly. These people saved my life when the men you met on the trail left me to die. The tableau held for a long moment, Sarah swaying slightly from weakness, Eleanor standing protectively beside her, Mason a few yards away with his weapon at the ready, Wilson and his men still on the trail below. Check the water when you return to Clearwater, Eleanor said, addressing the posse directly now, bypassing the sheriff entirely. Ask why more children have fallen ill since I left. Ask why the mining company pays your officials to keep silent. Enough! Wilson snarled, raising his rifle. I've got a job to do and I aim to finish it. Think carefully, Sheriff, Mason warned, his own rifle shifting to target Wilson specifically. You're outnumbered. There are 6 of us and 2 of you, Wilson sneered. I count 3 men still willing to follow you, Mason replied calmly. The others seem to be having second thoughts. Indeed, two of the posse had stepped back, lowering their weapons, uncertainty plain on their faces. "And I only need one bullet for you," Mason added, his aim unwavering. "Do you fancy those odds?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each heartbeat bringing them closer to bloodshed. Eleanor could see the calculation in Wilson's eyes, the desperate clinging to authority, the growing realization that his position had eroded. "Sheriff," one of the men said quietly, "maybe we ought to look into what they're saying. If there's poison in Clearwater's water, my family drinks from that creek," added another. The scales tipped imperceptibly at first, then with gathering momentum. Wilson found himself increasingly isolated as his men's certainty failed them. "This isn't over," he growled, lowering his rifle with obvious reluctance. "The law will catch up to you eventually." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, "but it will be true. Justice, not this mockery." With a final venomous glare, Wilson turned away, gesturing sharply for his remaining loyal men to follow. The others hesitated, then one, the man who had mentioned his sister's ill son, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he addressed Eleanor directly, "is it true what you said about the mine poisoning our water?" Eleanor nodded. "Metals in the ore. Mercury they use for processing. It seeps into groundwater streams, causes tremors, confusion, fever in children especially. Is there a cure? Clean water is the first step. Then certain herbs can help draw the poison out, strengthen the body." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "I could write down the remedies if you'd take them back." The man glanced toward Wilson, who was already mounting his horse, then back to Eleanor. "I'd be obliged, ma'am, for my nephew's sake." As the light began to fade from the day, an unexpected scene unfolded among the boulders. Eleanor, kneeling in snow, writing careful instructions for healing poisons that the miner could carry back to Clearwater. Mason stood watch, rifle ready, but no longer aimed, as Sheriff Wilson and his two loyal followers waited impatiently on the trail. The remaining men gathered around Eleanor, asking quiet questions about symptoms, treatments, preventions. Even Sarah contributed, describing how Eleanor's care had saved her from certain death. When the impromptu healing lesson concluded, the miner carefully folded Eleanor's instructions and tucked them securely inside his coat. "We'll look into the mine," he promised, "and if what you say proves true," the implication hung in the air, that justice might yet find its proper course, that truth might prevail over fear and greed. As the posse finally departed, following Wilson's sullen lead back toward Clearwater, Mason moved to Eleanor's side. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Wilson won't give up easily." "No," Eleanor agreed, watching the riders disappear around a bend in the trail. "But something changed here today." "What's that?" "They saw me," Eleanor said simply. "Not as a witch or a monster, but as a woman with knowledge worth having. That's a beginning." The confrontation had drained her last reserves of strength. As reaction set in, Eleanor's legs began to tremble, the edges of her vision graying. Mason caught her before she could fall, his strong arm supporting her weight. "Easy," he murmured. "You've done enough for one day." Sarah, too, had reached her limit, sinking down onto a rock, her brief surge of courage giving way to exhaustion. "Crooked Pine is still hours away," Mason said, assessing their situation with practical clarity. "And night's coming fast. We'll camp here and continue at first light." As he busied himself preparing a sheltered space among the boulders, Eleanor gazed westward, where the last rays of sunlight gilded distant peaks. The confrontation she'd feared for weeks had come, and while not resolved completely, had ended. Far differently than she could have imagined. She had stood her ground, spoken truth to power, found allies where she expected only enemies, and most surprising of all, she had reclaimed something she thought forever lost in that terrible night when Clearwater turned against her, her identity as a healer, not a fugitive. "You were magnificent," Mason said softly, returning to help. her to the shelter he'd prepared. "I've never seen a braver thing than you, standing up to Wilson and his guns." Eleanor smiled faintly, leaning into his strength. "I had good reason to be brave," she replied, glancing toward where Sarah now rested, then back to Mason's face. "Some things are worth fighting for." His grey eyes held hers for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then, with gentle hands that belied his size and strength, he led her to the fire he'd built, to rest and recover from a battle won, not with weapons, but with truth. As night wrapped around their small camp and stars emerged in the vastness above, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Not quite peace, for danger still remained, but perhaps its precursor. Hope, small but persistent, like the first green shoot breaking through winter soil. Wilson would return. Clearwater's judgment still hung over her, but she was no longer running blindly, driven only by fear. She had found her footing on this new path, unexpected though it was, and she was not walking it alone. Crooked Pine was hardly more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered along a single rutted street. But to Eleanor, emerging from the forest after days of perilous travel, it appeared as welcoming as any grand city. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, promising warmth. The sounds of human activity, axes chopping wood, children's distant laughter, a blacksmith's hammer striking anvil, filled the air. "Not much to look at," Mason commented as they paused at the settlement's edge. "But the people here mind their own business. That's worth more than fancy buildings." Sarah, still weak but able to walk short distances, leaned heavily on Eleanor's arm. "Will they help us?" "They will," Mason assured her. "Crooked Pine has its own rules, but hospitality is chief among them." They entered the settlement slowly, aware of curious eyes tracking their progress. A woman hanging laundry paused in her work. A man repairing a sled straightened to watch them pass. Children appeared in doorways, then darted out of sight to spread news of strangers. Mason led them toward a two-story building marked by a faded sign depicting a pine tree bent at an impossible angle. The trading post that gave the settlement its name. Before they reached it, the door swung open to reveal a barrel-chested man with a silver beard and one eye covered by a weathered patch. He stood on the porch, arms folded across his massive chest, assessing the newcomers with his remaining eye. "Black Ridge," he called, his voice like gravel underfoot. "Thought you'd be running traps till spring thaw." "Change of plans, Holt," Mason replied. "Got friends who need shelter and care." The man called Holt surveyed Eleanor and Sarah, his gaze lingering on their exhausted faces and trail-worn clothes. "Trouble?" he asked simply. "Some," Mason admitted. "Nothing Crooked Pine can't handle." A moment of silent communication passed between the men, old acquaintances assessing trust and risk. Then Holt nodded once, decision made. "Bring them in," he said, stepping aside. "Martha will see the women. You can tell me what kind of storm you've brought to my doorstep." The interior of the trading post was blessedly warm, smelling of wood smoke, tobacco, and coffee. The front room served as a general store, shelves stocked with provisions and necessities for frontier life. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the center of the room. "Martha," Holt called toward a back doorway. "Got guests needing attention." A woman appeared, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron, small but sturdy, with iron-gray hair twisted into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "I see that," she said, her gaze sweeping over the bedraggled trio. "The young one's sick." "Recovering," Eleanor corrected gently. "Pneumonia, but the fever's broken." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly at Eleanor's confident diagnosis. "You a doctor, then?" "A healer," Eleanor replied, the word feeling right on her tongue after so long being called something else. "A midwife, before—" She trailed off, uncertain. How much to reveal, but Martha simply nodded. Well, healer or not, you both look ready to drop. Come along. With brisk efficiency, Martha led Eleanor and Sarah through the back doorway into private quarters, a kitchen with a large hearth, doors leading to other rooms beyond. She settled Sarah on a chair near the fire, then turned to Eleanor. "You can tell me the whole tale later," she said. "For now, let's get you both warm, fed and rested. I suspect Mason and Ezra have business to discuss." Indeed, Mason and Holt had remained in the store, heads bent in quiet conversation. Eleanor caught Mason's eye as she followed Martha, receiving a reassuring nod before he turned back to the older man. The next hours passed in a blur of warmth and care, unlike anything Eleanor had experienced since fleeing Clearwater. Martha proved to be a healer in her own right, though she dismissed such notions with practical humor. "Just common sense and clean living," she said, helping Eleanor wash away weeks of trail grime in a copper tub set behind a screen in a small bedroom, though I wouldn't mind learning proper herb lore from someone who knows it. Later, seated at the kitchen table with Sarah asleep in an adjacent room, Eleanor found herself sharing her story with this straightforward woman who asked questions without judgment and listened without interruption. "Witch hunt in this day and age," Martha muttered when Eleanor finished. "Some folks never learn." "They were afraid," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the capacity for understanding she'd developed. "Fear makes people cruel." "Fear's no excuse for injustice," Martha countered, rising to check a pot of stew simmering over the fire. "But you're right. It explains much without justifying any of it." She ladled the rich stew into bowls, setting one before Eleanor, along with a thick slice of fresh bread. "Eat," she commanded. "You're thin as a winter shadow. Can't rebuild strength on air and good intentions." Eleanor needed no further encouragement, the stew's savory aroma awakening hunger that had been suppressed by constant vigilance on the trail. As she ate, Martha settled across from her with a steaming mug of tea. "What will you do now?" the older woman asked. "You and Mason?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. In the rush of escape and survival, she'd given little thought to what came after, to the shape a future might take. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Mason mentioned a valley beyond the pass, a cabin where we might be safe." Martha nodded thoughtfully. Sterling Valley. Good hunting, sheltered from the worst storms. Old Mackenzie's place, I'd wager. He left it to Mason when he passed. Left it to him? Mason saved the old trapper's life years back. Mackenzie never forgot the debt. Martha studied Eleanor over the rim of her mug. The valley's good land, isolated but rich in what matters. Game, timber, water. A person could build a life there if they'd a mind to. A life. The concept seemed almost foreign after weeks of mere survival. What would such a life look like? What did she want it to be? Before Eleanor could pursue these thoughts, the door opened to admit Mason and Holt, their discussion apparently concluded. "Sheriff Wilson's known in these parts," Holt announced without preamble. Never liked the man, too fond of his own authority and too quick with accusations. "He won't give up easily," Mason warned, accepting the bowl of stew Martha handed him. "Let him come," Holt said with a dismissive gesture. "Crooked Pine doesn't recognize Clearwater's jurisdiction, and we take care of our own." "We've only just arrived," Eleanor protested, touched but confused by the implied protection. Holt's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Mason's vouched for you. That's enough in these parts." Such simple acceptance after weeks of being hunted felt almost unreal. Eleanor looked to Mason, finding his grey eyes already on her, a question in their depths that matched her own uncertainty about what came next. Martha, perceptive as ever, rose from the table. "You two have plans to discuss," she said. "I'll check on the girl." When they were alone, silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighty with unspoken possibilities. Holt says we can stay as long as needed, Mason said finally. Winter work will be had for me, maybe healing duties for you if you're willing. Martha's the closest thing to a doctor here, but she's getting on in years. And after winter? Eleanor asked softly. Mason studied his hands, strong and calloused from years of wilderness survival. Sterling Valley is real, he said. So is Mackenzie's. A cabin. It needs work, but the bones are good. Land's fertile in spring. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. I mean to go there when the pass clears. I'd welcome your company, but I won't presume. The careful neutrality in his voice couldn't quite mask the hope beneath it. Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a sensation that had been growing since that first night in his cabin, when he'd shared his bread and story with a desperate stranger. What would life look like there, she asked, needing to envision this possible future. Quiet, Mason replied honestly. Remote. Hard work, especially at first. Garden to plant. Cabin. To expand, game to hunt. Winters are harsh but beautiful. He paused, then added more softly, lonely too, I expect, unless... The unfinished thought hung between them, filled with possibility. Unless it was shared, Eleanor completed gently. Mason nodded, vulnerability visible beneath his usual stoic exterior. I've grown used to your company, Eleanor Sullivan. More than used to it. It wasn't a declaration of love. They were both too practical, too shaped by hardship for such indulgences. But in its way, it was something more substantial, an offer of partnership, of mutual support, of chosen family when blood relations had failed them both. I'd like to see this valley, Eleanor said, her decision forming even as she spoke the words, to help make it a home. Something rare and precious transformed Mason's features, a full smile that reached his eyes, erasing years of solitude in an instant. He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. Then, we have a destination, he said simply, and a purpose. The days that followed took on a rhythm unfamiliar after weeks of flight, the rhythm of community and relative safety. Crooked Pine was indeed a place that valued privacy and self-sufficiency, traits that made outsiders' business unwelcome, including vengeful sheriffs from distant settlements. Word came through trappers and traders that Sheriff Wilson had indeed tried to pursue them to Crooked Pine, only to be turned back at the settlement's boundary by Holt, and a committee of stern-faced residents who made it clear that his authority ended at Clearwater's limits. More interesting were the rumors filtering back from Clearwater itself. Tensions, rising as more children fell ill, questions being asked about the mining operation upstream, divisions forming between those who still believed in witchcraft and those beginning to suspect a more earthly cause for their troubles. Seeds of truth you planted, Mason observed one evening as they sat before the trading post stove, listening to the latest news brought by a fur trader. Growing slowly, but growing nonetheless. Eleanor nodded, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, just a quiet satisfaction that healing might yet reach the community that had rejected her. Sarah's strength returned gradually. As she recovered, they learned more of her story, how she'd left Ohio to join her brother in the western goldfields after their parents' death, how the men who'd found her had seemed kind at first, offering guidance and protection until their true nature revealed itself. I'll still try to find my brother, she told Eleanor one afternoon as they worked together sorting Martha's limited supply of medicinal herbs. When I'm fully recovered. He's the only family I have left. Family isn't always blood, Eleanor replied, thinking of Mason, of Martha and Holt, of the connections formed through choice rather than birth. Sometimes it's who stands beside you when others walk away. Sarah considered this, her young face thoughtful beyond her years. Like you and Mason? Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks, but she didn't deny the implication. We've both lost much, found something unexpected in the aftermath. He loves you, Sarah said with youthful directness. Anyone can see it in how he watches when you speak, how he always knows where you are in a room. Eleanor's hands stilled on the herbs she was bundling. Love is a complex thing on the frontier, she said carefully. Practical matters, survival, shelter, security, sometimes outweigh tender feelings. Or maybe they're just different faces of the same devotion, Sarah suggested with surprising insight. Keeping someone alive, safe, sheltered, that's love too, isn't it? Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the trading post door banged open, admitting a flurry of snow and a frantic young man whose face was pale with urgency. "Healer, woman!" he gasped, eyes finding Eleanor among the store's scattered customers. "Please come! My wife! The babies are coming too soon!" Eleanor was on her feet instantly, healer's instincts overriding all else. "Twins?" she asked, gathering her shawl. The man nodded, terror plain in his eyes. "Not due till spring thaw. Started early, bleeding bad." Martha appeared from the back room, already gathering supplies into a basket. "The Collins place," she told Eleanor. "Mile east. I'll come too." "I'll fetch Mason," Sarah offered, heading for the door. He went to help with the logging. Outside, the day was already fading into the deep blue of winter twilight, the season's shortest day drawing to its close. The longest night lay ahead, a night when a premature birth might easily become a tragedy. "Solstice," Martha murmured, as they hurried through fresh snow toward the Collins homestead. Powerful time for beginnings and endings. The cabin they reached was small but well built, smoke billowing from its chimney against the darkening sky. Inside, chaos reigned. A young woman writhing on a bed, her belly swollen with impending birth, blood staining the sheets beneath her, an older woman attempting unsuccessfully to calm her. "I'm losing them," the young woman sobbed when she saw Eleanor. "My babies are dying." Eleanor moved to her side, touching her forehead, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. "Not yet, they're not," she said with quiet authority. "I'm Eleanor, I'm going to help you." What followed was a battle measured not in violence, but in the tenacious grip of life against death's pull. The young mother, barely 20, Eleanor, learned, was Emma Collins, newly arrived to Crooked Pine with her husband John after fleeing drought in Kansas. The twins were indeed coming too early, urged into the world by a fall Emma had taken on ice the previous day. The bleeding threatened both mother and unborn children. As the longest night of the year deepened around the cabin, Eleanor called upon every skill she possessed, every herb, every technique, every whispered encouragement learned at her grandmother's. Sighed and honed through years of bringing new life into the world, Martha worked beside her, steady and capable despite her age, following Eleanor's lead without question. Outside, men gathered, John Collins pacing anxiously, Mason arriving to stand silent vigil, other settlers drawn by word of the crisis. "Bleeding, slowing," Eleanor murmured after the first hours of careful work. "That's our first victory." But greater challenges lay ahead as Emma's labor progressed. The first twin presented poorly, requiring Eleanor to reach within and gently turn the tiny infant toward life rather than death. "My mother did this for me," Emma gasped between pains, her face ghostly pale. "Now I'll never see her again." "She's with you in your courage," Eleanor assured her, wiping the young woman's brow with a cool cloth. "In the strength you're showing now." Minutes stretched to hours as the solstice night embraced them in its protective darkness. Outside, men built the fire higher, melting snow for clean water, keeping vigil as women had done for birthing mothers, since time immemorial. Near midnight, as the world balanced between the year's death and rebirth, the first twin entered the world, a boy so tiny Eleanor could hold him in one hand, his cry no stronger than a kitten's mew. "Alive," Martha breathed, her eyes wide with wonder as Eleanor cleared the infant's mouth and nose. "It's a miracle." Not a miracle, Eleanor corrected gently, placing the swaddled infant in Martha's arms while she turned back to Emma. Just knowledge passed from woman to woman, generation to generation. What some call witchcraft, others call wisdom. The second twin emerged with less struggle, but even smaller than the first, a girl silent and still, until Eleanor breathed gently into her mouth, coaxing her to join her brother in the land of the living. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first pale promise of returning light, Eleanor finally stepped outside the cabin, exhaustion etched in every line of her body, but triumph shining in her eyes. The men waiting in the snow stood as one, faces anxious in the grey pre-dawn light. "Mother and twins live," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying in the crystal stillness. "Small, but fighters both." John Collins fell to his knees in the snow, tears freezing on his cheeks. Another man clapped him on the shoulder in wordless celebration. Mason moved to Eleanor's side, his strength supporting her as reaction set in. "You did this," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "When others would have given up, you fought for them." Eleanor leaned into his solid warmth, too tired for pretense or distance. "What I was meant to do. What I am." News of the birth spread through Crooked Pine like wildfire, transforming perception overnight. The woman who had arrived as a fugitive, suspected of witchcraft, was suddenly a miracle worker who had saved 3 lives on the year's longest night. Gifts appeared at the trading post door: smoked venison, hand-knitted blankets, jars of preserved fruit. Invitations followed, hesitant at first. Then, with growing confidence, women seeking advice for ailments long endured, mothers asking blessings for their children, men wondering if she might know something for rheumatism or old injuries that ached in winter cold. "They called me witch in Clearwater," Eleanor remarked to Mason one evening, a week after the birth, as they walked through Crooked Pine's single street under a canopy of stars. "Here they call me a healer for the same skills." "The difference is fear," Mason replied. "Clearwater feared what they didn't understand. These people seek to understand what they fear." Eleanor nodded, considering this distinction. "And you? What did you see when you found me in that barn?" Mason was silent for several paces, choosing his words carefully. "I saw someone broken but not destroyed. Someone worth saving." He glanced down at her, firelight from cabin windows catching in his eyes. "I didn't know then that you'd end up saving me in turn." "Saving you? How?" "From solitude, from believing the worst of humanity after what they did to Hannah." His voice softened. "From a life half-lived." They had reached the edge of the settlement where forest reclaimed the land. Above them, the northern lights had begun their silent dance across the winter sky, green and purple veils shimmering in the darkness. "Sterling Valley will be beautiful in spring," Mason said, looking toward the distant mountains still obscured at night. "Wild roses along the creek, deer bringing their fawns to water at dawn, days long enough to plant and build." The image he painted took root in Eleanor's mind, not an ending to their journey, but a beginning of something new and purposeful. "I'd like to bring my grandmother's remedies back to life there," she said, giving voice to dreams that had been forming since their arrival in Crooked Pine. "A garden of healing plants, a place where people could come when they need help." "Like the Collins twins," Mason suggested, "or others who have nowhere to turn." "Yes, not hiding what I know, but sharing it." Eleanor turned to face him fully, moonlight silvering her features. "Making something good from all we've endured." Mason reached out, his calloused hand gentle against her cheek. "We will," he promised. "Together." The word contained multitudes, partnership, trust, perhaps even love, though neither had spoken it aloud. What had begun in desperate flight had transformed into something neither could have foreseen when fate first crossed their paths in a snow-filled barn. As the longest night gave way to gradually lengthening days, plans took shape alongside deepening bonds. Sarah decided to remain in Crooked Pine until spring, accepting Martha's offer to teach her useful skills before continuing her search for her brother. The Collins twins grew stronger daily, their survival a testament to what knowledge could accomplish when fear was set aside. And Eleanor, once branded a witch for the very abilities that had saved those tiny lives, found herself reclaiming not just survival but purpose. The healer she had always been, transformed by hardship into something more resilient, more compassionate, more certain of her place in the world. A place that now, against all odds, included a former lumberjack with sad eyes, who had recognized in her something worth protecting long before she could see it in herself. A man who offered not rescue but partnership, not safety but shared strength against whatever storms might come. As winter's grip slowly loosened and the first hints of thaw appeared in southern exposures, Eleanor looked to the mountains that sheltered Sterling Valley, their future home still unseen but waiting. The path forward would not be easy, but it was theirs to walk together, and in that knowledge she found a peace that no witch hunt could shatter, no prejudice destroy. Not an ending, but a true beginning, born like the Collins twins, on the longest night when darkness seemed complete, yet carrying within it the first spark of returning light. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.